The British Museum, London. Late afternoon. The light slants low through the high windows of room 55, and the Mesopotamian gallery is mostly empty at this hour. A guard sits on a stool near the entrance, watching nothing in particular. The cases hum with their own quiet electricity, glass and brass and the steady breath of climate control. In one of those cases, smaller than you might expect, a flat brown rectangle of baked clay rests on a small cushion of grey foam, about the size of a paperback book, edges chipped, surface darkened by 4,000 years of dust and earth, and the slow chemistry of being buried. On its face, in tight and deliberate rows, the script of a dead language. Cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay by a reed stylus, and then left to dry and then forgotten, and then found. The label beside it is brief. Cuneiform tablet with the Atrahasis epic. Old Babylonian, copied around 1646 to 1626 BCE. From Sippar, southern Iraq. Museum catalogue, BM 78941. What the label does not say is what the tablet says. The tablet describes the manufacture of a species. Our species. It says in patient and deliberate language that humans were assembled from clay and from the body of a slain god, and that the assembly had a purpose. It says we were made for work. It says we were made to free another order of beings from labour they no longer wish to perform. The tablet was copied in the reign of King Ammi-Saduqa by a junior scribe named Ku-aya. He signed his name in the colophon. He wanted to be remembered. 4,000 years later, we are reading him. Tonight we are going to walk through what this small tablet says, slowly, with patience. The tablet has waited 4 millennia to be heard. We can take our time with it. This is for the wanderers, for the seekers, for the curious minds who keep wondering whether the history we have been taught is complete. Now let us descend into the archive, into the dust, into the question that the Sumerians refused to look away from. Picture the land first. Southern Mesopotamia between the Tigris and the Euphrates. A flat alluvial plain, dust-coloured, salt-crusted at the edges, cut by reed marshes where water meets sky. In the modern map, this is southern Iraq. In the deeper map, the one that runs in thousands of years rather than tens, this is the cradle of the first cities humanity ever built. The Sumerians did not call themselves Sumerians. They called themselves Sag-Giga, the black-headed people. The name Sumer was given to them later by their Akkadian-speaking neighbours. The Sumerian language itself is a linguistic isolate. It is related to nothing else we have ever found. It surfaces, fully formed, in the cuneiform record, around 3000 BCE, and then after about 2000 years, it fades from daily speech and becomes a temple language, a liturgical language, like Latin in medieval Europe. Sacred. Archaic. Preserved. They built in mud brick because there was no stone. They built temples on top of older temples and then again on top of those until the temples became artificial mountains. We call those mountains ziggurats. The greatest of them stood at Ur. The oldest of them stood at Eridu. Eridu. The Sumerians said Eridu was the first city, not the first of their cities. The first city, the first place on earth in their understanding, where human beings gathered in numbers and built walls and made laws and divided labour. Their foundational document, the text we now call the Sumerian King List, begins with a single sentence that, if you let it settle, is one of the strangest sentences ever written down. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. The text survives most completely on a small clay prism that sits today in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. About 20 centimetres tall, 4-sided, covered in tight cuneiform on every face. It is called the Weld-Blundell Prism, after the English collector Herbert Weld-Blundell, whose expedition recovered it from the ruins of Larsa in 1922. It was carved roughly 4,000 years ago, around 1800 BCE. It lists the kings of Sumer in order, beginning long before history. The first king is Alulim. He ruled at Eridu. According to the prism, he ruled for 28,800 years. Read that number again. The second king, Alalgar, reigned for 36,000. The third for 43,200. There are 8 kings before the flood, ruling 5 cities, and the combined total of their reigns, as recorded in the Sumerian king list, comes to 241,200 years. After Eridu, kingship passed to Bad Tibira, then to Larak. then to Sippar, then to Shuruppak. And then, in the dry voice of the scribe, this single line: the flood swept over. After that flood, the rains become reasonable. They become earthly. The numbers drop from tens of thousands to hundreds, then to decades, then to the kind of numbers a real human king might actually live. Something in the Sumerian account has changed. Something fundamental separates the world before the flood from the world after. And the men who wrote this down were not poets being loose with figures. They were temple scribes, accountants, mathematicians. The Sumerians invented the sexagesimal system, the base of 60 that we still use today for time and for angles. A unit called a sar equaled 3,600 years. The kings before the flood reigned in multiples of sar. The arithmetic, in its own internal logic, is precise. It is worth pausing on this. The civilization that invented written arithmetic recorded the reigns of its first kings in numbers that, by any modern reckoning, cannot be biological. And yet they wrote them down, and yet they preserved them, copy after copy, for centuries, in temple after temple, in city after city. What if the numbers are not literal? What if they are code, or compressed memory, or simply a way of saying that the time before the flood was so long it had no proper measure? Scholars have argued both sides for more than a century. Thorkild Jacobsen, the Danish-American Assyriologist who produced the definitive critical edition of the King List in 1939, leaned towards a poetic reading. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent 6 decades at the University of Pennsylvania translating Sumerian texts, leaned towards mythological compression. Others have read them as straight numerology, as encoded astronomy, as something else entirely. The tablets, in their patient way, do not explain themselves. What the tablets do, instead, is repeat. The same story appears with variations across centuries and across cities. There are gods. The gods are tired. They want servants, they make humans. They make them from clay. And in the older versions, in the Akkadian and the Sumerian, they make them from clay mixed with something else. Something taken from a god. Blood. Spirit. Intelligence. This is the centre of the matter. This is what the tablet at the British Museum says, in essence, and what other tablets in other museums say in different words. This is what scholars call the dual substance creation. Clay plus divinity, earth plus heaven, the body that returns to dust and the spirit that returns to wherever spirit comes from. Now, before we go any further, a word about what this is not. This is not a video about a single fringe theory. This is not a sales pitch for one writer's interpretation. The Anunnaki appear extensively in actual cuneiform records. Their names appear. Their hierarchy is described. Their relationships with humans are laid out in patient and meticulous detail by scribes who stake their professional lives on getting the words right. None of that is in dispute among qualified scholars. What different readers do with that record varies. Some treat it as theology, some treat it as mythology, some treat it as encoded history. We are going to walk through what the tablets actually say, slowly, in their own language, and we are going to let the strangeness sit where it is. Picture yourself now, standing at the edge of Eridu, as it would have looked 5,000 years ago. The marshes stretch out behind you. Reed boats pull silently across still water. Ahead of you, on a low rise above the plain, a white temple climbs into the sky. Mud brick washed and polished, doorways edged in bitumen. At the top, a small dark room kept cool where the god is said to live. The god of Eridu is Enki, the god of fresh water, of wisdom, of crafts of cunning. The Sumerians believed that Enki had given them the city, given them irrigation, given them writing. They believed that Enki had given them themselves. The temple stood for a long time. Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, 2 archaeologists working for the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities in the late 1940s, peeled the mound at Eridu back layer by careful layer and found 18 superimposed temples, each built on the wreckage of the last, the oldest reaching down to around 5300 BCE. That is the deepest unbroken cult continuity ever excavated in Mesopotamia. 7,000 years of people climbing the same hill to honour the same god. When the first temple at Eridu was built, there was no Egypt yet, no Indus Valley cities, no Stonehenge, No pyramids of any kind. The first temple at Eridu predates the wheel. It predates the alphabet. It predates almost every human invention we associate with what we now call civilization. And yet it was already there, already standing, already remembering. Imagine that. 7,000 years of returning to the same place. 7,000 years of saying, in mud, brick and offering, and quiet ritual, that we have not forgotten. The Sumerians had a word for the time before time. They called it the time of the Apkallu. 7 sages, sometimes depicted on cylinder seals as fish-cloaked figures, sometimes as winged beings, who emerged from the sea at the beginning of things and taught humanity the arts of civilization. The first of them was Adapa, also called Uan, or in the later Greek of Berossus, Oans. Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote in the 3rd century BCE for a Greek reading audience, described Oans coming up out of the Persian Gulf each day to instruct the people in writing, mathematics, agriculture, law, and the building of cities. At night, the fish sage returned to the water. The Apkallu are not marginal figures in the tradition. They appear on cylinder seals across millennia. They appear in the Era Epic. They appear in a list of 7 sages from Uruk, written down on a tablet now catalogued by archaeologists as W2037. Mainstream Assyriologists like Erica Reiner and Alan Lindsay read them as mythological transmitters of me, the Sumerian word for the divine arts of civilization. Other readers, working outside the academy, have read them differently. We will come in time to that question. For now, the relevant fact is this. The Sumerians believed civilization did not invent itself. They believed it was given. Given by whom? Given how? Given for what reason? These are the questions the tablets, in their slow and patient way, attempt to answer, or sometimes simply hold open. Now, let us return to the British Museum, to the case in room 55, to the small flat brown rectangle of clay copied by Kuaya in the reign of King Ami-Saduqa, to the words on its surface, because the Atrahasis epic, which is what we call that tablet now, begins with a strange and specific scene. A scene that nobody invented in the modern world. A scene that surfaces, unbidden, from the wet clay of the old Babylonian period, and has been waiting for 4,000 years to be read again. When the gods were like men, the tablet begins. They bore the work. They suffered the toil. The toil of the gods was great, the work was heavy, the distress was much, and from that line everything else follows. Let us slow down and look at this opening carefully, because it is one of the most peculiar opening lines in all of ancient literature. Translated into the careful English of Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard, working at Oxford in 1969, the Akkadian reads in transliteration as Enuma Elish, when the gods, like man. Not when there were no men yet, not in the beginning. The grammar is precise. There was a time, the tablet says, when the gods themselves did the labour, when the gods were the workers. Now this is already an unusual claim for any creation story to make. Most creation myths around the world begin with gods at rest, gods in glory, gods looking down from above onto the chaos they are about to organise. The Atrahasis tablet begins with gods at work, gods complaining, gods sweating, gods digging. The text names 2 classes of divine beings. The senior gods, the Anunnaki, who in this telling number around 600, and the junior gods, the Igigi, who number 300. The Anunnaki, says the tablet, made the Igigi bear the toil. They imposed 7-fold labour on them. The Igigi dug the great canals. They cleared the riverbeds. They piled up the mountains. They counted the years of their labour, the text says. In near, 40 near of digging, 40 of clearing, 40 of carrying. By the calculations of Mesopotamian sexagesimal mathematics, NER is 600. So 40 near is 24,000 of something. Most translators, including Lambert and Millard and Stephanie Daly after them, take this as 24,000 years. Others read it as idiom for a very long time. Either way, the labour was long enough that the workers, the Igigi, finally broke. Now picture, if you can, what comes next. A junior god somewhere in the dark of one of those canals sets down his basket. He looks at his blistered hands. He says to the god beside him, "This is enough." They pass the word along the line. The shovels are laid aside. The fires are kindled. The Igigi march by night on the house of the great god Enlil, the chief of the Anunnaki, the one who imposed the labour. They surround his temple. They burn their tools. The text is calm about this. The text simply describes it. The Igigi, the tablet says, set fire to their tools. They surrounded the sanctuary. They cried out, and the cry was a great noise in the night. Inside the temple, Enlil wakes. His vizier Nusku wakes him. There is something at the gate. There are figures with torches. There is the smell of burning wood. Enlil sends Nusku out into the courtyard to ask who has come. The answer that comes back is short. Every single one of us gods has declared war. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive. It is killing us. That sentence in the Akkadian is striking. The gods are not protesting unfairness. They are protesting mortality. They are protesting a labour that is too much for any being to bear. What follows is a council. The senior Anunnaki convene. They consider the rebellion. They consider that the work, after all, must continue. The canals must be dug, the riverbeds cleared, the earth fed. The gods themselves cannot return to the labour. Someone, the tablet says, must be made to take the burden. It is here that Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom and crafts, the god of the city of Eridu, speaks. And it is here that the strange and central proposal of the entire Atrahasis tablet is laid out, in language so specific and so unsettling that the senior scribes of Babylon copied it carefully, again and again, for nearly 2,000 years. Let Nintu, the womb goddess, Enki says, be present. Let her mix clay with the flesh and the blood of a god. Let her fashion a creature. Let the god, in his very being, be mixed into the clay, so that man, when he comes to be, shall know that he is part divine, so that the heartbeat of the god shall be in him, so that the workload of the gods shall pass to him. Read that proposal carefully. It is not to create a worker from nothing. It is to create a worker that contains, within his flesh and his thinking, the very substance of a god. The clay alone is not enough. The body alone is not enough. There has to be, in the construction, an additional element, something taken from divinity itself. The council agrees. A god is chosen. The tablet names him We-Ilu or We-Ila, depending on which scholar's transcription you prefer. He is described in the tablet as a god who possessed Temu. The word matters. Temu in Akkadian means planning, intelligence, divine reason, the capacity to formulate intent. He is a god, in other words, who has interior life, who has mind he is slain. The text does not soften this. The Anunnaki council kills the god We-Ilu. His body is cut open. His flesh, his blood, and his Temu, his thinking principle, are gathered up. And these are mixed with clay. The mother goddess Nintu, also called Mami in this passage, also called Belet Ili, also called Banat Awilutim, the creatress of mankind, receives the clay. She kneads it. She prays over it. The Anunnaki council spits into the clay, the tablet says, as a kind of witness, a kind of binding seal. And from this mixed substance, 14 humans are shaped, 7 male, 7 female. They are placed 2 by 2 in brick birthing rooms. They are delivered, after the proper time, by the Great Mother. And they begin immediately to take up the basket and the shovel that the Igigi had set down. Now there is a piece of Akkadian wordplay buried in this passage that no translation can quite carry across, and that scholars consider crucial to what the tablet actually says. The god who is slain possesses Temu, intelligence. After his death, the same root produces another word, etemu. Etemu means ghost, spirit, the lingering presence that remains after death. The tablet states, in line 230 of tablet 1, that when the god is slaughtered and mixed into the clay, his etemu, his ghost, becomes a permanent presence in the body of every human. From the flesh of the god, the tablet says, there shall be an etemu, so that the living, when they remember themselves, shall not forget the god, so that the heartbeat shall not let it be forgotten. This is what Wilfrid Lambert, in his 1969 edition with Alan Millard, considered the theological centre of the entire Atrahasis epic. The tablet is not just saying that humans were made for labour, it is saying that every human carries, inside their physical body, the residue of a slain divinity. That the human heart, the human mind, The human capacity for thinking and remembering is the residual presence of a God who was killed so that we could exist. Let that thought sit with you for a moment. The human is made from earth, plus the substance of a god, plus the ghost of a god, all bound together by the counsel of the Anunnaki and the hands of the mother goddess. The clay is the body. The flesh of Welu is the matter. The blood of Welu is the life of. And the Temu, the divine intelligence, is what makes the human able to think at all. Now consider what this means in the context of the late Bronze Age world. The Babylonians, when they wrote and copied this text, were a sophisticated urban civilization. They had mathematics, they had astronomy, they had law codes, they were not naive. The scribes of Sippar, who copied the tablet Qi assigned in the 17th century BCE, were trained for years in the Aduba, the tablet house, before they were allowed to inscribe anything for the temple library. They knew what they were writing. They were preserving, with deliberate care, a story about the origin of the human species that placed at its centre a single dark act. A god was killed. From his death we are made. What if, the tablet seems to be asking, the price of being conscious is that something divine had to be torn apart so that we could carry it? What if the reason humans feel the strange ache of mortality, the longing for transcendence, the sense that we are more than dust, is because we are? Because something old and something other is mixed into us, and it remembers what we cannot. The tablet does not stop there. After the creation, the humans multiply. They become numerous. They become loud. The text says, in a line that scholars love to quote, that the land bellowed like a wild bull. The din of humanity reaches the heavens. The senior gods, in their celestial peace, find themselves unable to sleep. And from that disturbance, in the second and third tablets of the Atrahasis epic, comes the flood. We will return to the flood. But first we must look at the other tablets, because Atrahasis is not the only text that tells this story. It is one of three, and possibly more, that all describe in different language the same impossible event. Let us now turn to a tablet held not in London, but in Berlin, in the Vorderasiatisches Museum on Museum Island. In a glass case in a quiet upper gallery, there is a tablet catalogued as VAT 9307. It is also known by its older designation KR. KR is the abbreviation for Keilschrifttexte aus Assur religiösen Inhalts, the great compilation of religious cuneiform texts from the city of Ashur, published by the German Assyriologist Erich Eberling in 1919. The tablet itself was recovered from the temple library at Ashur, in northern Iraq, in the early years of the 20th century. It is a Middle Assyrian copy, made in roughly the 14th or 13th century BCE, of a text that is almost certainly much older. What makes Ka 4 remarkable is that it is bilingual. Each line is given first in Sumerian, then in Akkadian. The scribes of Ashur wanted both languages to be present. They wanted, possibly, to ensure that the older Sumerian tradition could be checked, line by line, against its Akkadian rendering. And the story the tablet tells is a variant of the Atrahasis account, with one important difference. In Ka 4, the gods who are slain to create humanity are not one, they are two. The text names them as the Lamga gods. The Lamga were a pair of artisan deities, smith gods, makers, beings associated with skill and craft. The Anunnaki and the council described in KR4 decide that humans will be needed for the work of the gods. And they say in the careful bilingual lines copied by some unnamed scribe nearly 3,000 years ago that the two Lamga shall be slaughtered, and their blood shall be the substance from which the humans are made. The same pattern, in other words. A divine sacrifice, a god or gods whose substance becomes the human, a clay body animated by stolen divinity. And then there is the Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation, epic, copied across centuries and across cities, recited every year, scholars believe, at the Akitu festival in Babylon, the great New Year ceremony, in which the king reaffirmed the cosmic order. We have the Enuma Elish complete on 7 tablets, from the library of King Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, around 3,000 years old in its standard recension, likely older in its original composition. The Enuma Elish is, on its surface, a different story. It is the story of how the young god Marduk, of the city of Babylon, rises to supreme power among the gods by slaying the primordial chaos dragon Tiamat. It is in part a political document. It explains why Babylon is the center of the world, why Marduk is king of the gods, why the king of Babylon, the human king, is the proper agent of cosmic order on earth. But in Tablet 6, after Marduk has slain Tiamat and ordered the cosmos, he turns his attention to the question of labour. The gods, in this telling too, are tired. They have been working. They have been building. Marduk, in a passage that scholars have studied for over a century, makes a declaration to his father Ea, the Akkadian name for the Sumerian Enki. I shall create Lulu, Marduk says. Man shall be his name. He shall bear the burden of the gods, so that they may be at rest. The word Lulu in Akkadian is worth pausing on. It is the word the text uses for this newly fashioned creature. The Chicago Assyrian Dictionary translates it as savage man, primitive worker. It is not the word for an ordinary human, an awailu. It is a special word for the first humans, the manufactured humans, the prototype. Wilfred Lambert, in his definitive 2013 study Babylonian Creation Myths, devoted multiple pages to this single word. Lulu, he wrote, was a technical term in the Mesopotamian creation tradition. It denoted the human not as a natural species, but as a constructed one, a made thing, and the substance from which the Lulu is made. In the Enuma Elish, it is again the blood of a god. This time the god is King, the consort of Tiamat, who has fought on the side of chaos and who has lost. Kingu is captured. He is brought before Marduk, he is questioned. He is slain. And from his blood, mixed with clay, the first humans are fashioned. 3 texts, 3 slightly different stories, 3 accounts that, in their broad structure, agree. The labour was too heavy. The gods rebelled. A divine victim was selected, killed, and his substance mixed with clay. And from that mixture, humans were made. Consider how patient these tablets are about saying something terrible. There is no apology in the text. There is no attempt to soften the violence at the centre of the act. The god is killed. The clay is mixed. The human walks out of the brick birthing room and picks up the shovel. And the work continues. Now let us consider what kind of culture would write such a thing down, and what they may have been remembering when they did. Consider for a moment who the Sumerians actually were when they first set down a story in which a god is murdered so that a person can exist. Because the temptation, looking at any culture 3,000 or 4,000 years removed from our own, is to assume that they were simpler, that they thought in dreams, that they did not weigh their language the way we weigh our language. The Sumerians, on the careful evidence, were not simpler. They were the inventors of so many of the categories we still use to think with, that the modern world has barely improved on their basic furniture. They invented writing, not picture writing, but a phonetic and syllabic script, flexible enough to record law, mathematics, astronomy, poetry, contracts, prayers, prescriptions, and accounting in a single medium. They invented the city. They invented the temple as an institution. They invented the school. They invented the legal contract. They invented the irrigation system that allowed a desert plain to feed a population that would have been impossible without engineering. They invented, in some real sense, civilization itself. And the city in which, by their own account, all of this began was a place called Eridu. If you look at the southern flank of modern Iraq, in the governorate of Dikar, near the present town of Nasiriyah, you will find a mound rising slightly above the flat alluvial plain. Tel Abu Shahrin. This is Eridu. In 1946, an Iraqi archaeologist named Fuad Safar and a British archaeologist named Seaton Lloyd, working for the Iraq Directorate General of Antiquities, opened a trench into the mound and began to descend. They expected perhaps 3 or 4 levels of occupation. What they found between 1946 and 1949 was 18 superimposed temples, each one built on the ruins of the last. Each one dedicated, the evidence suggests, to the same god, Enki, the lord of fresh water, the wisdom god, the maker of humans in the Atrahasis tradition. The lowest level, the deepest brick floor, lay on virgin soil and dated by ceramics to around 5,300 BCE. Which is to say, when the first temple at Eridu was built, the world's oldest city was already over 7,000 years old by the time the Atrahasis scribes copied their tablets in Sippar. Eridu was to Babylon what Babylon is to us, an impossibly ancient place, a place at the beginning of memory. The Sumerians, in their king list, did not invent Eridu as a setting. Eridu was real. The 18 temples were real. The god Enki, who designed humans in the tablets, was the god whose house was rebuilt continuously on the same patch of ground for nearly 2,000 years. The civilization that wrote the slain god creation story was a civilization that lived inside an unbroken religious memory, longer than the entire history between Charlemagne and the present moment. This is what I find difficult to fully absorb when I sit with these texts late at night. The Sumerians were not transmitting a story they had just invented. They were transmitting a story they had been telling, in some form, for as long as anyone could remember telling it. The Atrahasis tablet that Kuai signed in the 17th century BCE is itself a copy of older material. The version preserved in KR4 is a copy of an earlier Sumerian original. And behind those copies, somewhere in the dust at the bottom of the Eridu Trench, behind the 18th temple, lies the world in which somebody first imagined, or first remembered, that a god was killed so that we could be made. Now let us consider the older version, because there is one. In 1944, working over a tablet from Nippur held in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, Samuel Noah Kramer published a translation of a Sumerian text known as Enki and Ninmah. The tablet is Old Babylonian, dated to roughly the 18th century BCE, but the Sumerian language of the composition and the story itself appear to be considerably older. It is a different version of the creation story, a version closer perhaps to the original. The tablet begins like Atrahasis with the gods complaining. The labour is heavy, the Anunnaki cannot bear it. The mother of the gods, Namu, the primordial saltwater ocean, wakes her son Enki and says to him, in lines Kramer rendered carefully, "My son, rise from your bed, work what is wise, fashion servants of the gods." The body of the servants, the tablet says, shall be made of clay. The clay shall be taken from the surface of the Abzu, the deep fresh water that surrounds the world. Enki agrees. He calls his mother Namu and the mother goddess Ninmah. He calls also, the tablet says, 7 assisting birth goddesses. They gather the clay. Namu pinches off pieces of it. Ninmah shapes them. And from this collaborative work, the first humans are formed. There is no slain god in this Sumerian version. The substance is clay alone, taken from the deep waters. Some scholars, including Thorkild Jacobsen, have read this as the older, simpler form of the story. The later Akkadian versions in this reading added the slain god to deepen the theological claim. Other scholars, including Lambert, have suggested the reverse, that the slain god is the original element, and the Sumerian text is a softened later version. The textual evidence does not entirely settle the question. What is striking in either case is what happens after the creation. Enki and Ninmah, having shaped humanity, hold a banquet to celebrate. They drink date wine, the tablet says. They become drunk. And Ninmah, in her drunkenness, begins to boast. "I can shape any human I wish," she says, "good or bad, strong or weak. The form depends on my hand alone." Enki, equally drunk, replies, "Whatever you make," he says, "I can find a place for in the world." The contest that follows is one of the strangest passages in all Sumerian literature. Ninmah shapes 7 malformed humans. A man who cannot close his hands. A man who is blind. A man who cannot walk. A barren woman. And so on through the 7. Enki, the tablet says, finds a place for each of them. The blind man becomes a singer at the king's court. The man who cannot walk becomes a scribe. The barren woman is given an honoured place in the temple. The text is, in its way, a remarkable document. It is one of the oldest extant statements that variation in the human form is not a flaw in creation, but a feature of it. The deeper point of the contest, however, lies elsewhere. The point is that creation, the way the Sumerians understood it, was not a clean process. It was experimental, provisional. The first humans were prototypes. Some came out right. Some came out wrong. The gods, in this telling, were not infallible engineers. They were makers learning their craft. Picture for a moment the implications of that. A creation story in which the creator is not perfect, in which the first batch of humans included errors, in which the gods themselves, drunk on date wine, were uncertain what they were doing. This is not the language of a religion that has reached late-stage abstraction. This is the language of a memory of a process with versions, a process with failures. Now let us return to the question of substance, because in both the Sumerian and the Akkadian creation accounts, The human body is made of one specific material: clay. The Akkadian word is t.du, sometimes spelled titu. The Sumerian word is im. Neither term means dirt in general. Neither means dust. Both name the specific plastic clay that the river deposits along the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. The clay that the Mesopotamians used daily to build their houses, to fire their bricks, to mould their cult statues, and to inscribe their tablets. The clay, in other words, that they knew most intimately of any substance in the world. When a Sumerian or a Babylonian scribe wrote that a god mixed clay with divine substance to make a person, he was not reaching for an abstract symbol. He was naming the material he himself was holding in his hand at that moment. The tablet he was writing on. The brick of his own house. The clay was alive to him in a way it is not alive to us. It was the universal medium. It carried thought. It carried memory. It carried, in the form of cuneiform impressions, the spoken word made permanent. And it carried, the tablets say, the human form itself. There is a remarkable Sumerian incantation, published in a 2014 study by Boilere, Watanabe, and Altawil, addressed directly to the clay pit. The line in its English rendering runs simply: "Clay pit, you are the creator of God and man." Read that line again. Clay pit, you are the creator of God and man. Not just that the human is made of clay, the god is made of clay. Sabay. The very statue of the god in the cell of the temple was made of clay. The matter of divinity and the matter of humanity in the Mesopotamian imagination came from the same source, the same wet plastic earth, dug from the same riverbank, shaped by the same human hands. What separated them in the tablets was not the substance, it was the breath, the animating element, the temu. Now let us slow down on this word, because Wilfred Lambert and Alan Millard, in their 1969 edition of the Atrahasis text, spent several careful pages on it, and the matter is worth pausing for. Temu in Akkadian is a difficult word. It is sometimes translated as planning, sometimes as understanding, sometimes as intelligence, sometimes as the personal god, the divine spark inside an individual that distinguishes one human from another. It is the thing that allows a person to form an intention, to weigh a choice, to remember the past and project the future. It is, in the Mesopotamian framework, what makes a person rather than merely a body. When the god Wee-Ilu is slain and his temu is mixed into the clay, the tablet is making a precise claim. It is saying that the human, in being created, received not just the matter of a god, but the thinking principle of a god, the intelligence, the capacity for interior life, the thing that makes us know we exist. And here is where the wordplay enters. The Akkadian root behind temu, the consonant tm, produces another word, etemu, the ghost, the spirit of the dead, the lingering presence that remains in the body of a living person. And that is, the Mesopotamians believed, what makes us mourn. What makes us dream of those who have died. What makes us feel that something of the dead persists, somewhere, just out of sight. Atrahasis Tablet 1, line 230, states directly that the etemu of the slain god becomes the etemu inside every living human. The ghost of the god, the tablet says, shall be in the flesh, so that the heartbeat shall not let it be forgotten, so that the living shall not forget that a god died to make them, so that the heartbeat shall not let it be forgotten. What moves me about this passage, reading it years after I first encountered it, is how unflinching the text is. The Babylonians did not believe that humans were noble. They did not believe that humans were merely fallen. They believed, in a way that no later religion has quite captured, that humans were haunted. Haunted by an act of violence at the moment of their own creation. Haunted by a god who was killed so that we could pick up the shovel and continue his work. And this haunting, the tablet says, is not metaphor. It is in the body, in the heartbeat, in the rhythm that the heart makes every second of every life. The ghost of the slain god remembers what we have all forgotten, that we are, in some sense, walking memorials, that we are, in some sense, the burial place of a divinity. Now let us widen the lens, because this is not the only way in which the Mesopotamian tablets describe the relationship between the gods and the human form. There is, in the Akkadian language, a different word, salmu. The Sumerian equivalent is alan. Both words mean image, likeness, statue. They are the words used for the carved or moulded figures of gods that stood in the cellars of temples, and they are also, in certain texts, the words used to describe the relationship between gods and humans. The human, in some Mesopotamian traditions, is the salmu of the gods, the walking image, the living statue. If you have ever read the opening chapters of the Hebrew Bible, that phrasing should strike you. Genesis 1:26 has Elohim say, "Let us make humanity in our image, after our likeness." The Hebrew word for image is selim. It is the same Semitic root as the Akkadian salmu, the same word in essentially the same grammatical construction, asserting essentially the same claim, that humans are not just creatures. They are images. They are visible representatives of an invisible source. They carry in their form the form of something else. The Hebrew text does not include the slain God. The Hebrew text does not include the blood, the counsel, the mixed substance. It includes only the breath. Yahweh, in Genesis 2:7, forms Ha-Adam from the dust of the Adamah and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. The wordplay in the Hebrew is itself precise. Adam, the human. Adamah, the red ground. Damn the blood. All from the same Semitic root meaning red, the colour of earth and of life. The structural parallel to Mesopotamia is unmistakable. The substance is earth. The animating element is divine. The product is a creature that bears somehow the mark of its maker. What changes between Mesopotamia and Israel is the violence. The Babylonian creation story is a murder. The Hebrew creation story is a breath. The Babylonian human walks under a debt. The Hebrew human walks under a gift. But the shape of the claim, the underlying anthropology, is recognizably the same. Earth plus something from above equals person. And it is here that we should begin to ask the question of when. When, in the Sumerian framework, did this creation actually happen? When did the gods rebel, the divinity die, the clay walk? The tablets, as it happens, are not vague on this point. They have an answer. And the answer is buried inside a single artifact, recovered from the dust of southern Iraq in 1922, and held now behind glass in a quiet upper gallery of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The object is called the Weld-Blundell Prism, after the English antiquary who funded the expedition that recovered it. It is small, smaller than most listeners expect when they walk into the Ashmolean and find it behind glass, 20 centimetres tall, 8 centimetres wide on each of its 4 faces. A vertical clay prism, the colour of dried tobacco, slightly tapered, inscribed on all sides in dense, regular Sumerian cuneiform. The lines are tight. The work is patient. Each character was pressed into wet clay by a scribe who held the reed stylus the way a careful writer today might hold a pen, with attention, with the awareness that what he was recording was meant to last. It was recovered in 1922 by an expedition led by Herbert Weld-Blundell, working at the site of ancient Larsa in southern Iraq. Larsa, by the time Weld-Blundell's team arrived, was a mound of broken brick, rising out of the alluvial plain, the remains of a city that had once been the seat of a kingdom in its own right before being absorbed by Babylon in the 18th century BCE. The prism itself dates to around 1800 BCE. When it was found, it was already nearly 4,000 years old. It had been buried in the debris of a private house, perhaps belonging to a scribe, perhaps to a temple official. We do not know. What we know is what it says. The text opens in Thorkild Jacobson's careful 1939 translation, with a single line that has the cadence of an opening verse. After kingship had descended from heaven, the tablet says kingship was in Eridu. Read that line a second time. After kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. The text does not begin with a hero. It does not begin with a god deciding to make the world. It begins with a structural claim. Kingship, the principle of human governance itself, did not arise from below. It descended from above. And the first place on earth where it settled, the first city to receive it, was Eridu. The same Eridu beneath whose 18 temples Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd were digging in 1946. The same Eridu sacred to Enki, the maker of humans. Now let us slow down and listen to what comes next. Because what comes next is a list of kings. In Eridu, the tablet says Alalim became king. He ruled 28,800 years. Al-Algar ruled 36,000 years. 2 kings, ruling 64,800 years between them. Then the kingship was transferred to Bad Tibira. Pause on the number, 28,800 years, for a single reign. If you are listening carefully, the natural first response is to dismiss the figure. To say, as many Victorian readers said when George Smith and his successors first published these lists, that the Sumerians were exaggerating. That this is myth, not record. That the numbers are poetic, the way a court poet might inflate a king's age to flatter his memory. But the Sumerians, on the careful evidence, were not given to mathematical caprice. They were the people who invented the mathematics we still use, the sexagesimal system, the base 60 that gives us the 60 seconds in a minute, the 60 minutes in an hour, the 360 degrees in a circle. Sumerian arithmetic is, in Eleanor Robson's 2008 study of Mesopotamian mathematics, one of the most internally consistent computational traditions of the ancient world. These were not people who threw numbers around for effect. And here is the curious detail that has long fascinated scholars of the king list. The reigns are not arbitrary figures. They are calculated in clean multiples of the Mesopotamian time units. The Sar of 3,600 years, the Enia of 600, the Soso of 60. Alulim's 28,800 year reign is exactly 8 Sars. Al-Algar's 36,000 is exactly 10. Enmenluana 12. The pattern continues down the line, and when the 8 antediluvian reigns are totalled, when the kings of Eridu and Bad Tibira and Larak and Sippar and Shuruppak are added together, the sum is 67 Sars exactly. 241,200 years, a round, calculated, deliberate figure. Whatever the king list is doing, it is not doing it carelessly. The numbers are tuned. They are spoken in a register that the Sumerians themselves understood as mathematically clean. 8 kings, 5 cities, 67 Sars. Now let us widen the comparison, because the Sumerians were not the only Mesopotamians who counted in this register. Around the year 290 BCE, a Babylonian priest named Berosus, serving in the temple of Bel-Marduk in Babylon under the Seleucid king Antiochus I, set down in Greek a history of Mesopotamia for his Hellenistic patrons. His book, the Babyloniaca, has not survived directly. We possess it only through fragments quoted by later writers, including the Christian chronographer Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century, and the Byzantine monk George Syncellus in the 9th. But the fragments are enough. Berosus, writing more than 1,000 years after the Weld-Blundell scribe, gives a parallel list. 10 kings, he says, ruled before the Great Flood. Their names are Greek transliterations of names we recognize from the Sumerian. Alaros is Alulim. Xisuthros is Ziusudra, the flood survivor, in between 8 others, and the total length of their reigns in Berosus is 120 Sars, 432,000 years. 432,000. That number, if it sounds familiar to you, should sound familiar. It is the same figure, almost exactly, that appears in the Hindu calculation of the Kali Yuga. The current age of the world in Vedic chronology is said to last 432,000 years. The full Mahayuga cycle, 4 times that. The same number reverberating across continents that had no obvious contact in 2 of the oldest surviving cosmological traditions on Earth. I am not, in saying this, suggesting that the Sumerians spoke to the authors of the Vedas. The textual evidence does not support direct contact between the 2 traditions. What I am suggesting, and what comparative mythologists from Joseph Campbell onward have noted, is that the human imagination, when it tries to count the time before history, reaches for similar units. Long units. Multiples of 3,600. As if the species in different places were reaching for a number large enough to hold the same long stretch. Now let us return to the prism. Because the king list does not stop with the antediluvian reigns. It continues. After 8 kings, the text says, the kingship had ruled in Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak for 67 Sars. Then the flood swept over. The flood swept over. That single line, on a clay prism in the Ashmolean, is the oldest extant reference in any written human document to a great flood that ended the first age of the world. It predates Genesis by more than 1,000 years. It predates the Greek deluge of Deucalion by more than a millennium. It is the original written memory of a catastrophe that, in cultures across Eurasia, marked the boundary between what came before and what came after. And here is what makes the prism strange, what makes it almost difficult to read carefully. After that line, "the flood swept over," the king list continues. It lists the post-diluvian kings, the kings who ruled after the waters receded, and the reigns after the flood become different. In the city of Kish, the first city to receive kingship after the flood, the tablet says, the first king was Jusha. He ruled 1,200 years. The next Kulasina Bel ruled 960. The third, Nangishlishma, ruled 670. The numbers are still long, by any modern standard, impossibly long, but they have shrunk by an order of magnitude. The Tsars are gone. The reigns are no longer multiples of 3,600. They are calculated, the text suggests, in something closer to ordinary years. By the time the list reaches the historically attested kings, the kings whose names appear in contemporary inscriptions, and whose buildings still stand in the dust at Kish, at Uruk, at Lagash, the reigns are recognizable. 20 years, 30, 50. The figures match the human lifespan we know. What happened, the tablet suggests, was that something fundamental changed at the moment of the flood. The age before was an age of long lives, long reigns, long stretches of slow time governed by figures whose duration in office defies any biological reading. The age after is an age of ordinary mortality, the age of human history as we recognize it. The text is, in its own framework, drawing a line, a caesura. A before and after that is not merely chronological, but ontological. What moves me about this, returning to the prism late at night, after years of reading it, is how unflinching the Sumerians are about saying that something changed. They do not soften the transition. They do not narrate the flood as a gradual diminishment of the human estate. They simply mark the line and continue. Before the flood, Tsars. After the flood, years. Before the flood, kings of mythic duration. After the flood, kings of recognizable mortality. The text is, in this sense, a record of a discontinuity, a break in the kind of being humans were. Now let us pull on another thread, because the antediluvian period in Mesopotamia is not just an age of long-lived kings, it is also, in the parallel literature, the age of 7 sages. The Sumerian word is apkallu. The Akkadian is the same. They appear in dozens of texts, most fully in a composition called the Uruk List of Kings and Sages, recovered in the 1960s from a temple library in the southern Iraqi city of Uruk. The list pairs each antediluvian king with a sage who served him. Alulim, the first king, was served by Uan, the first sage. Each subsequent king, similarly, had his own apkallu, his own counselor. The apkallu are not described as ordinary humans. The texts say that they emerged from the sea, that they were sent by the god Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, to teach humanity the arts of civilization. Writing, mathematics, architecture, law, medicine, astronomy, metalwork. The crafts, the texts say, that distinguish a civilized people from an uncivilized one. The apkallu brought these from somewhere else. The texts are explicit on this point. The knowledge did not arise from within the human community. It came from outside it. Berossus, again, gives the fullest picture. The first sage, he writes, was named Oannes. Oannes was a creature with the body of a fish, and underneath, the body of a man. He emerged each morning from the Persian Gulf, walked among the people of the southern marshes, and taught them. He taught them, Berossus says, all the knowledge of letters and arts and crafts. He taught them how to construct cities. He taught them how to make laws. He taught them mathematics. And at the end of each day, when the sun set, Oannes returned to the sea. This description, preserved in the Babylonica, is not a Hellenistic invention. Berossus claims it from the Babylonian temple records to which, as a priest of Bel-Marduk, he had access. And the figure of the fish-cloaked sage appears independently in cuneiform tablets that long predate Berossus. The Era epic, composed perhaps in the 8th century BCE, references the apkallu. The bilingual incantation series Beat to Meseri does as well. The iconography of Assyrian palace reliefs at Khorsabad and Kalhu shows bearded figures in fish cloaks standing guard at the doorways of kings. The sages were real to the Mesopotamians. They were, in the official register of the temples, the source of human civilization. Consider what this means in the structure of the king list. The antediluvian period is not just an age when kings lived for tens of thousands of years. It is an age when knowledge itself was given. The Apkallu walked among humans, teaching them. The arts of civilization were not, in this telling, invented by human ingenuity. They were transmitted from beings who came, the texts say, from the water, from somewhere outside the ordinary human community. And then, after the flood, the Apkallu stopped coming. The post-Diluvian period in Mesopotamian literature has no fish-cloaked sages walking out of the Persian Gulf to teach kings. The transmission, as the Mesopotamians understood it, was complete. What humanity had received before the flood was what humanity would have to work with afterwards. The teachers had departed, the students were on their own. Let that thought sit with you for a moment. A civilization, 4,000 years old, looking back at its own beginnings and saying, in the most matter-of-fact tone possible, that the foundational arts of human life were not invented by human beings, that somebody else brought them, that the somebody else came from the water, that the transmission ended at the flood, and that everything humans have done since, every city, every contract, every astronomical calculation, every poem in clay, has been a continuation of an instruction received in the antediluvian dark. This is not, I want to stress, a fringe reading. This is what the cuneiform actually says. Wilfrid Lambert spent his career making sure the Apkallu texts were translated accurately and published. Erika Reiner, in her 1961 study in the journal Orientalia, traced the etiological myth of the seven sages through its full literary history. Alan Lindsay, in his 2008 book Secrecy and the Gods, examined how the Mesopotamian priesthood understood themselves as the inheritors of Apkallu knowledge, transmitting it down the centuries through the temple schools. The reading is established. The texts are clear. What is debated, and what we will need to consider next, is what to make of it. Because the question that the Apkallu raise, the question that has hung over the Mesopotamian creation tradition since the first translations of the king list, is a question that no scholar entirely escapes. If the Sumerians said that knowledge came from outside, and the texts they wrote down were copies of older traditions, and those older traditions reached back, in Eridu, to the very edge of human memory itself, then what exactly were they remembering? What were they remembering? Let us hold that question and walk forward into it carefully. There is a temptation, when confronted with material, this old and this strange, to fold it immediately into one of two ready-made frameworks. The first framework, the one the Academy has held since the late 19th century, says that the Sumerian creation tradition is myth. That myth is a category we understand. That myth, in the technical, anthropological sense, is a story a culture tells about itself to explain the conditions of its own existence. By this reading, the Apkallu are personifications of cultural transmission. The slain god in the clay is a theological proposition about the dual nature of human being. The flood is a memory of the periodic inundations of the Tigris and Euphrates, perhaps the great inundation that left a thick layer of clean silt at Uy and Shuruppak around 2900 BCE, blown up to cosmic proportions by later poetic imagination. This is in broad outline the reading you will find in Thorkild Jacobson, in Samuel Noah Kramer, in Wilfrid Lambert, in Andrew George. It is the careful, restrained, philologically grounded reading of the tradition. And it has the virtue of being conservative. It does not ask the listener to believe anything beyond what the texts, as literary documents, were trying to say. The second framework, the one that has grown up alongside the Academy since the late 20th century, says that the tablets are not myth, that they are something stranger, that when the Atrahasis epic describes the Igigi gods rebelling after 40 years of forced labour, after digging the canals and bearing the basket of toil, and when the senior gods then decide to make a substitute labourer by slaughtering one of the rebels and mixing his flesh and blood with clay. What we are reading is, in compressed and poetic form, a memory of an actual event. The most prominent figure associated with this reading was Zecharia Sitchin, whose 1976 book, The 12th Planet, popularised the proposition that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors, that the labour they came to perform was the mining of resources on Earth, and that humanity was engineered through what we would today call biotechnology to take over that labour. Now let us be careful here. because the two frameworks are not symmetrical, and treating them as if they were would be a disservice to the listener. The first framework, the academic one, is a reading of what the texts say. It is conservative because it limits itself to what the texts, taken as literary and theological documents, are doing within their own cultural context. The second framework, the Sitchin reading, is an interpretation of what the texts might mean if they are read as compressed historical record of events, external to the symbolic system in which they were composed. The first framework can be checked, line by line, against the cuneiform. The second framework cannot be checked in the same way, because it requires that the cuneiform be reread in a register that the original scribes, on all the available evidence, did not have access to. I want to say two things about this. The first is that the Anunnaki, as a category of beings, appear extensively in the actual cuneiform record. This is not in dispute among qualified Assyriologists. The word Anunna, or Anunnaki, appears hundreds of times across the corpus, from the Old Sumerian period through the Neo-Babylonian, designating the senior council of gods, the divine assembly that meets to make decisions about the cosmos and about humans. The texts are clear that the Anunnaki are powerful, that they include the great deities An and Enlil and Enki, and that they are involved repeatedly in the affairs of human beings. This much is straightforward textual fact. The second thing worth saying is that what Sitchin did with this material, the specific planetary mechanics he proposed, goes beyond what the cuneiform itself supports. The Assyriologist Michael Heiser, in a careful 2010 study, and others before him, have shown that Sitchin's translations of specific Sumerian terms do not match what the words actually mean in the established lexicon. The hypothesis of a 12th planet, the specific orbital periods, the identification of the Anunnaki with travellers from that planet, these are interpretive overlays on the tablets. They are not statements drawn from them. The texts do not say this. Sitchin said this about the texts. I am not telling you what to do with that. The relationship of a careful reader to material of this antiquity is, in the end, a personal one. What we can do is keep our gaze on what the tablets themselves describe, separately from the question of how to interpret what they describe. Because the tablets, even on the most conservative reading, are saying something extraordinary. And the extraordinary thing they are saying is worth sitting with on its own terms before we ask what kind of memory it might be. So let us return to Atrahasis. Let us slow down and read carefully what the old Babylonian scribe Aya wrote, around the year 1646 BCE on the tablet, now catalogued in the British Museum as BM 78941. Because the Atrahasis epic, more than any other text in the Mesopotamian creation tradition, is unflinching about the procedure. The opening of the epic, in Lambert and Millard's 1969 translation, sets the scene. When the gods, like men, bore the work and suffered the toil of the gods was great, the work heavy, the distress much. 300 Igigi, in some versions 600, were excavating the rivers. They dug the Tigris. They dug the Euphrates. They built the watercourses, the canals, the dikes that would, much later, make Mesopotamian agriculture possible. The labour went on, the text says, for 40 Nea, a very long time. And then the Igigi rebelled. The detail of the rebellion on the cuneiform is striking in its psychological specificity. The Igigi conferred among themselves. They burned their tools. They surrounded the great house of Enlil, the chief god, at the middle watch of the night. Enlil, awakened, was afraid. The senior gods convened a council. They debated what to do, and it was Enki, the wise god of Eridu, the god of fresh water and craft, who proposed the solution. The solution, in Atrahasis Tablet 1, line 190 and following, is given with the cool precision of a technical procedure. Let the birth goddess create Lulu, the savage man. Let him bear the yoke. Let him take the toil of the gods. That word, Lulu, is worth holding. The Akkadian Lulu, sometimes written Lulu Amelu, has been the subject of careful philological work by Wilfrid Lambert. The base meaning is savage, primitive, unfinished in the sense of an undomesticated being not yet brought into the full social order. The Lalu is not, in the Mesopotamian schema, made in the full likeness of the gods. He is fashioned for a purpose. He is, in the explicit language of the text, made to take the toil. The gods are tired. They want rest. The Lulu will work in their place. Let that thought sit with you, because it is, in the most matter-of-fact register that an ancient text can sustain, a statement about the reason for human existence within the Mesopotamian framework. We were made to work. We were made so that the gods would not have to. Now comes the procedure itself, and this is where the text becomes precise, in a way that makes modern readers uncomfortable, regardless of what interpretive framework they bring to it. Enki tells the council that the Lulu will need three components. He will need clay, Ta'du, in the Akkadian, Im, in the Sumerian, the same word used for the material from which bricks were shaped and tablets were inscribed. He will need flesh, Shoru, the body itself, and he will need Timu. That last word, Timu, is where the text reaches its strangest depth. In the Akkadian dictionary, Temu has a range of meanings: planning, intent, reason, intelligence, the capacity for ordered thought. It is the cognitive principle that distinguishes a person from an inanimate object. And the text says, in unmistakable terms, that the Lulu will need this. That clay alone is not enough. That flesh alone is not enough. That the human, in order to be human, requires something that the clay does not contain. Where does the Temu come from? The text answers this directly. From a god, specifically from the rebel god who is to be slaughtered. The Atrahasis text in line 223 names him Wei-Ilu, sometimes transliterated Wei-Ila, sometimes Ilawela. The text describes him as the god who has planning, the god who has intelligence. The text is precise on this point. It is this god, the one in possession of the cognitive principle, who must be killed, because it is from him that the Lulu will receive what the Lulu cannot otherwise possess. The procedure follows. The senior gods slaughter Wei-Ilu in the assembly. The birth goddess Nintu, also called Mami, also called Beletil, the one whom the text designates as Banat Alutim, creatress of mankind, mixes the slaughtered god's flesh and blood with clay. She kneads the mixture. She shapes it. She forms 14 human beings, 7 male and 7 female, in the original framing. And the text adds, with one of the most haunting wordplays in Mesopotamian literature, that from the flesh of the god an Atemu came into being. The Akkadian Atemu means ghost, spirit, the shade of the dead that persists after the body has gone. And the word, as Lambert and Millard noted in 1969, is constructed so that it echoes Temu, the divine intelligence. The two words share a phonetic root. The text is making, on the level of language itself, the claim that human consciousness, the thing that survives us, the ghost that the Atemu names, is the same thing as the divine planning principle that Wei-Ilu contributed at the moment of his death. What this says, in the most literal possible reading of the cuneiform, is that every human being walking the earth carries, within their flesh, the residue of a god who was killed at the dawn of the world, that the part of us that thinks, that plans, that persists after death as a ghost, is not native to the clay. It was placed in us. It came from somewhere else. This is not Sitchin. This is what the old Babylonian scribe Qi'ya wrote on his clay tablet in the 17th century BCE. Now let us widen the frame, because Atrahasis is not the only Mesopotamian creation text that says this. In the Enuma Elish, the standard Babylonian creation epic preserved in copies from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, tablet 6 opens with Marduk, having defeated the chaos goddess Tiamat, addressing his father Ea, who is the Akkadian name for Enki. I shall create Lulu, Marduk announces. Man shall be his name. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at rest. Ea responds by telling Marduk how it must be done. One of the gods, Ea says, must be given up. The council of the Anunnaki convenes. They debate. They identify Kingu, the consort of the defeated Tiamat, the one who had incited the rebellion of the chaos forces, as the responsible party. Kingu is bound. Kingu is slaughtered. From Kingu's blood, the text says, Ea fashions humanity. The procedure is the same. A god is killed. His blood combined with the appropriate material becomes the substance of a new being. The new being is made for service. The new being is human. And in the bilingual creation text known as Ka 4, recovered from the Middle Assyrian temple library at Asher and copied around the 14th century BCE, the same structural account appears once more. Two divine figures, the Lamga gods, are slaughtered. Their blood becomes the substance of humanity. Humans are made to serve the gods, to maintain their temples, to perform the rites, to bear the burden of cosmic maintenance that the gods themselves no longer wish to perform. Three texts, three independent recensions written in different centuries, in different cities, by different scribal schools, and all three say the same thing. Clay or earth, plus the blood and flesh of a slaughtered god, equals the human being. The procedure is consistent. The components are consistent. The purpose, in every case, is the same. We were made for the labour that the gods did not want to perform. What moves me about this consistency is how it cuts against the easy dismissal. It would be one thing if Atrahasis stood alone, an old Babylonian poem with its own idiosyncratic vision. We could read it as the work of one school, one scribe, one moment in the long tradition. But when the same procedural account appears in the Enuma Elish, composed 500 years later, in a different city, in a different theological school, and again in KR4, in yet another setting, in yet another century, the question shifts. The pattern is too durable to be incidental. The Sumerians and the Babylonians, across more than 1,000 years of textual transmission, kept telling the same story about how humans came to be. And the story, in all its versions, is a story of substitution, of a god dying so that humans could live in his place, of the divine being killed so that the human could carry the residue. Now let us hold this thought against the only other ancient creation tradition with which most listeners will be familiar. Because the Hebrew scriptures, written down some centuries after the Mesopotamian texts but drawing, as scholars from Hermann Gunkel onward have shown, on the same cultural reservoir, give us a parallel account whose echoes of the Mesopotamian schema are unmistakable. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. The Hebrew reads, in transliteration, Vayitzer, YHWH Elohim et ha'adam afar min ha'adama, Vayipach be'apav nishmat hayim, Vayhi ha'adam lenefesh hayya. The Lord God formed ha'adam, the human, from afar from the dust of ha'adama, the arable ground, and he blew into his nostrils nishmat hayim, the breath of life, and ha'adam became a nefesh hayya, a living being. The wordplay in the Hebrew is precise. Adam, the name of the first human, and Adama, the ground from which he is made, share a Semitic root that means red. The same root, in Hebrew, gives us dam, blood, earth, blood, human. The same three components the Mesopotamian text had been combining for 1,500 years before the Genesis author put his reed to scroll. The same triad, the same procedure. Earth plus a divine animating element. The Hebrew prefers breath where the Akkadian prefers blood, but the structural logic is identical. The human is composite, the human is clay plus something else. The something else, in every case, comes from above. What the Hebrew does that the Mesopotamian texts do not is remove the labour framework. The Hebrew God does not need rest. He does not require a substitute. The making of the human in Genesis is not motivated by divine fatigue. It is motivated by something the text does not fully explain, something that the rabbinic tradition has spent 2,000 years trying to articulate. The human in Genesis is made because Yahweh wills it to be made. The reason is not given in the same procedural register the Babylonians used, but the components are the same: earth and a God's animating substance. The clay walks because something from above was placed in it. The question that the Mesopotamian text answer brutally and the Hebrew text answers obliquely is the same question. Where exactly did consciousness come from? The texts of the ancient Near East taken together are unanimous on one point. It did not come from the clay. The implications are uncomfortable. The texts are not, on careful reading, doing what most modern readers would prefer them to do. Consider what the framework demands. If the texts are pure invention, ex nihilo cosmology, composed by scribes who had spent too much time staring at clay, then the consistency of the procedure across 1,000 years and three independent recensions becomes very hard to explain. Three independent scribal traditions, working in different schools, in different cities, in different centuries, all converging on the same odd procedural detail. Earth, plus the blood of a slaughtered god. Why not something simpler? Why not just clay shaped by hand, like the Egyptian Khnum at his potter's wheel? Khnum at Esna and at Elephantine did shape humans from Nile clay on a potter's wheel. He gave them the ka, the divine spirit, that animated them. But the Egyptian text does not require the death of a god to do it. The breath, the ka, simply comes from Khnum himself, who lives on. There is no slaughter. There is no transfer of substance from one being to another. The Egyptian human is fashioned. The Mesopotamian human is composed. The Mesopotamian story is darker and odder and more specific. The god has to die for the human to exist. Something has to be transferred. Something has to leave the divine and enter the mortal. And the texts are insistent on the particular mechanism of that transfer: blood, flesh, the temu that becomes the etemu, the ghost in every chest. If this were a single text, we could call it the metaphysical flourish of a single poet. But it is not a single text. It is a tradition. It is what the Mesopotamian scribal class said, again and again, for over a millennium, about where we came from. Now let us consider, finally, the question that the texts force upon any reader who sits with them long enough. What is the right register in which to receive this material? There are 4 registers available. They are worth naming carefully, because none of them, on its own, is sufficient. The first register is the mythological. The texts are stories. They are theological literature, in the proper sense of the word. They are an attempt by an early civilization to articulate, in narrative form, the relationship between the divine and the human. They do what good mythology has always done. They explain. They orient. They give the listener a place in the cosmos. On this reading, the slaughter of Wee-Ilu is a way of saying that we are dust-touched by something more than dust. It is a poetic compression of the dual nature that humans, in many cultures, have intuited about themselves. The second register is the historical. The texts are memory, compressed, distorted, transmitted through generations of oral tradition before they were ever written down, but memory nonetheless. The Mesopotamian flood narrative was dismissed as pure invention for centuries, until the excavations at Nineveh recovered tablet after tablet, and until the silt layers at Ur and Shuruppak, dated to around 2900 BCE, confirmed that yes, in fact, there had been an enormous regional inundation around that time. The flood was not invented out of nothing. It was the literary memory of an actual event. The question this raises, when we extend the same logic to the creation narratives, is whether the same might be true of them. Memory, distorted. Memory compressed. Memory, dressed in the language of gods because no other language was available. The third register is the symbolic. The texts are about something that they themselves do not entirely understand. The slaughtered god, the clay, the breath, these are images the Mesopotamians were reaching for in the absence of any other framework. On this reading, the texts are not pretending to be history, and they are not pretending to be myth. They are gesturing toward a question they cannot answer in any other way. Where does the inside of a human come from? Why do we have what we have? The texts cannot say. They can only image it. The fourth register, the one that lies outside the academy, and that has grown up in tension with it, is the literal. The texts mean exactly what they say. A god died. Material was mixed. The human came into being through a procedure that we would, in the language of the 20th and 21st centuries, call engineering. What needs to be said about this register has already been said. It is not what the cuneiform record, taken as a whole, allows us to demonstrate. The Anunnaki are not, in the texts, described as travellers from a planet on a 3,600-year orbit. They are described as the Council of the Gods. Sitchin took a leap that the tablets did not. But the tablets, even without the leap, are saying something extraordinary. What the tablets did do, and this is the harder thing to sit with, is offer a procedural account of human origins that no other ancient literate civilization, on the evidence we currently possess, offered with quite the same combination of specificity and matter-of-factness. The Egyptian texts gesture, the Hindu texts cycle. The Greek philosophers, when they reach the question, prefer abstraction. The Sumerians and Babylonians, alone among the ancient cultures whose creation literature has come down to us in volume, wrote it as procedure, with ingredients, with a method, with a named god who had to die so that the substance could be transferred. That specificity, whatever we decide it means, is the thing that the texts will not allow the careful reader to forget. Now let us return to where we began. Picture yourself once more in the gallery. The room is cool. The light from the case is soft. Behind the glass, on a felt-lined cradle, sits a small rectangular object, the size of a man's hand, the colour of dark sand, scored across its surface with the wedge marks of a stylus pressed into wet earth 36 centuries ago. The tablet is BM 78941. The British Museum catalogue records it with a few flat sentences. Old Babylonian. Sippar. The reign of King Ammi-Saduqa. The hand of a junior scribe named Ku'aya, who pressed his name into the colophon at the end of his work, perhaps because he was proud of having finished, perhaps because he had been told to. Ku'aya wrote in the 17th century BCE. He wrote in a language that nobody had spoken as a native tongue for thousands of years. The story he was copying was already by his time old, already ancient, already passing through hands that had inherited it, from hands that had inherited it, from a tradition whose origin was beyond the memory of any living scribe. And on the clay he pressed the procedure. The clay itself, the flesh, the blood, the timu of the slaughtered god, the 14 humans, 7 male and 7 female, kneaded by the birth goddess from a paste that was not entirely earth and not entirely divine. He pressed this in the dim light of an oil lamp in a scribal house in Sippar, with the calm of a man performing a task he had performed many times before. He was not, on the evidence of the tablet, troubled by what he was writing. He was a copyist. He was preserving a text that his tradition had judged worth preserving. He had no way of knowing that, of all the tablets he would write in his life, this one would survive when most of the others crumbled. The tablet did survive. It survived the fall of Sippar. It survived the Babylonian dynasties that came after Ammi-Saduqa. It survived the Persian conquest, the Hellenistic empires, the Parthians, the Sasanians, the Islamic conquests, the Mongols, the Ottomans. It lay in the buried scribal quarter, under the dust of the dead city, while Rome rose and fell, while cathedrals were built in northern Europe, while continents were crossed by people who did not know its name. And in 1882, the Assyrian-born British archaeologist Hormuzd Rassam, in the service of the British Museum, pulled it out of the ground at Tel Abu Haba, and the long journey from clay to glass case began. Now it sits behind the glass in London. Someone, somewhere, is looking at it tonight. Perhaps a student leaning closer to read the small explanatory card. Perhaps a tired tourist who does not yet know what he is looking at. Perhaps a curator, walking through the gallery after closing, checking that the case is dry and the light has not faded, and the writing is still legible. The cuneiform has not faded. The wedges remain as sharp as the moment Ku'aya pressed them. A modern Assyriologist with the right training can sit before that case and read the lines and follow the procedure the old Babylonian scribe set down for us. The technology of clay turned out to be more durable than papyrus, more durable than parchment, more durable than paper, more durable in many respects than the digital archives we trust today. Ku'aya chose well, though he did not know he was choosing. What moves me about this when I sit with it late at night is the patience of the thing. The scribe Ku'aya had no idea that the question he was preserving would still be open 36 centuries later. He had no idea that, in the year of our calendar 2026, a person somewhere in the world would be listening to a voice describe the procedure he had written down. He pressed the reed into the clay because his tradition told him to preserve the text. He did not know what he was setting in motion. He could not have known. And yet here we are, reading him, receiving the story, holding the question. The clay outlasted the empire that produced it. It outlasted the empires that came after. It will, in all likelihood, outlast us as well. The question of where we came from, of why there is something inside us that does not seem to belong to the clay, of why every human culture that has ever picked up a stylus or a pen or a brush has reached for the same answer in different words, is still as live tonight as it was when Ku'aya wrote. The tablets do not tell us what to do with this. They are not prescriptive. They do not demand belief. They do not even, on careful reading, demand a particular interpretation. What they demand is attention. They demand that we sit with what they say, that we take seriously what an ancient scribal class was willing to commit to clay, that we do not, in our embarrassment about how strange the answer is, simply pretend that the answer was not given. The answer was given. We were made, the tablets say, from earth and from the substance of something that died so that we could live. We carry, every one of us, a residue. We carry, the texts say, a ghost. The thing inside us that plans, that grieves, that wonders, that asks where it came from, is not native to the matter that holds it. It was placed there. By whom, by what, in what manner, the tablets answer in their own register, in the only language they had. We can decide what register we receive that answer in. We cannot decide that the answer was never offered. What moves me when I think about Ku'aya in his scribal house in Sippar is the image of him finishing. The failing light of a late afternoon, 36 centuries ago. He writes his name. He adds the date. He sets the stylus down. He looks at the tablet. He does not know that we are reading him. He does not know that we are listening. He simply finishes his work. He goes home. And the clay begins its long wait. The clay is still waiting. It has been waiting in the British Museum since 1882. It will be waiting tomorrow, and the day after, and the year after that. The tablet does not need to be believed. It only needs to be read. If this story stayed with you, a like helps other wanderers find this quiet place. There is more waiting for you in the playlist. Other tablets, other names, other lines that nobody has yet translated. The Sumerians wrote because they wanted to be read. 4,000 years later, we are still reading them. The conversation is not over. Thank you for staying with me through this story. The tablet is still there, in the case. In London, the names are still on it. Someone, somewhere is reading them right now.